this was happening before that, but really came to fruition, or full breadth, was all these soldiers are coming home from World War II, and you got the GI Bill, and what are they doing? They're going into universities and colleges. I mentioned at the time, I said, that's how my dad went to college at the University of Iowa. And so on the GI Bill, and a lot did. And so all of a sudden, you have these institutions are getting huge influx of people, and it wasn't just ours. And so what do you do about that? Well, those that ran those institutions said, hey, we need some help. Can you help support us? And so they were asking congregations to help provide support, because just individuals wasn't going to meet those needs, so to speak, is kind of how it went. And so that's a little bit of the story of what's going on there, and there's a back and forth. Well, the disciples, the Christian church into things, this wasn't so much of a problem, because they had embraced these things of modernism early on, and these ways of doing things and so on. So they were already there. But for us who held on to that, primal beginnings and looking back and the New Testament and so on, that was a little harder, because these are modern things, and our thinking is still holding on to this. So how do you make those mesh? And so, and again, apologize, we're having technical difficulties. So, that's probably, we're having AV difficulties, so it's probably not streaming. Yeah. So thank you. And so we've talked about G.C. Brewer, and he was one of the Texas preachers that during the premillennial controversy was one that was really preaching that those aspects of grace much more than kind of the whole, than the majority of the body was. And so, how does one straddle this? How does one keep that primitive Christianity, the restoration of the New Testament church, and still embrace these things that are modern? And that's what's going on. And so G.C. Brewer typified this struggle, consistently pleading the cause of primitive undenominational Christianity. Brewer was perhaps the most influential leader among churches of Christ to encourage congregations to support colleges from the congregational treasury. He did so first in an important address at Abilene Christian in 1931, and again in a series of articles in the Gospel Advocate. Now, significantly, none of these appeals raised much opposition at the time. Okay, they go, okay. It's true that throughout the 30s, Foy Wallace and others questioned the growing power of colleges, but it was not until the late 30s and early 40s that this really, kind of exploded as you need to take a side on this. And so there was also efforts by several college presidents and former college presidents who didn't like these attacks. Now think about it. You're the president of college. You believe in the education and what you're doing, and you're getting those that are saying, "Hey, you can't do that." And so we see this tension that's developing. And so there was a number of these presidents that weren't supporting Wallace's point of view, and they were also supporting the new publications that we talked about, Christian Leader, though that was short-lived, and also the Gospel Advocate, and so, or 20th Century Christian, excuse me. And so as early as September of 1938, Wallace saw this combination emerging that would set out to control schools, churches, and preachers. Not surprisingly, he and his followers increasingly opposed that supporting colleges out of the congregation's budget. And so what does this somewhat get down to? The idea that we talked about, that they were so concerned and worried that their autonomy, that we talked about was going to be infringed upon, and they're going to be dictating that to us. Now, I know Gerald has shared, I don't know, maybe it was just you and I talking, or maybe you did publicly in the Christian church, that there was those issues with the different missionary groups that were supporting and kind of dictating down to congregations, and you can't go there because that group's going there, and so on and so forth. And so it's not that some of those concerns were necessarily without any foundation. So even more important than the premillennial politics was the sudden influx of students, as we said, into colleges. Colleges everywhere sought to raise funds for new facilities to accommodate the growing student demand, and our colleges were no different. In 1947, Robert Alexander of Abilene Christian sought to raise $3 million for expansion of the college. And, certainly then that's a tidy sum. But the dormitories and things such as that. Well, Roy Codgill, we've mentioned him before, of Lufkin, Texas, who was the publisher of the Bible Banner, was incensed, and he informed Alexander that we are old-fashioned here in East Texas and are not in sympathy in any way with your efforts to enlist churches in support of the school. And so we see certainly the pushback. Of far more importance than Alexander's efforts on behalf of Abilene were N.B. Hardeman. Now, we've heard of N.B. Hardeman. We talked about him. Freed Hardeman. He was one of the starters of that down in Tennessee. Remember, in the 1920s, 30s, Hardeman was a huge name there around Nashville, and we showed some images too of where he preached at what was the Grand Ole Opry building, the auditorium, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands that came to hear him. And so he was very influential. Well, he has a school to run. Now, it's interesting that during that premillennial controversy, he sided with Wallace and pushing out Bowl and those other guys that had held those, those premillennial views. Yet in this situation, I got a college to run. And so he took the position of it's okay to support the out of the congregational funds, and so that created conflict with them. He says these people he claimed would erect beautiful meeting house, meaning those that were under Wallace's camp, put carpets on the floor, fans in the ceiling, install a baptistry, provide for water to be heated, buy baptismal robes, hire a janitor, buy fuel, provide nurseries, and hire babysitters, would do practically anything except make a donation to a school where the Bible is taught. If we are not careful, we'll be straining out gnats and swallowing camels. And so it's interesting in all these, in all these things, certainly how people frame their positions and then take these various scriptures to make their position seem right and the other person's not. And yet, it's not that he doesn't have some points there, because he does. But he's saying, hey, it's okay to spend it. Now remember what's going on, this transition in buildings that we talked about. Going from just the clapboard places out, and now we're getting better. And so part of that's in that answer, in that transition of what's going on. And so anyhow, Hardeman and Wallace quickly came to a parting of ways over the issues, dramatizing the serious tensions that attended the institutionalizing efforts that were going on, recalling that Wallace had earlier changed his position on the issue of pacifism, because remember, Wallace at one time was a pacifist, and then he changed that because sometimes events and circumstances cause us to look at things with a different perspective. And so Hardeman now sought to discredit Wallace as unfit to lead the church, being unstable. Hardeman concluded, he cannot be a safe teacher. He is double-minded, and a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. All because he doesn't think like him. And how often have we heard that over time? How often did we hear strange fire thrown out and labeled on things? And of course, that's referring to about Nadab and Abihu. And the scripture says that they offered strange fire, and so God struck them down. And so what's been done over time is anything that I think is not correct, that must be strange fire. And so, and those things that happen, well, we see that happening here. That was not new, a new way of doing things. And so it's like who's the one that fires it out first? Going on in this controversy, unfortunately. Wallace then responded, M.B. Hardeman has never been a friend to any man beyond the use that he can make of that man. And that when he learned that I do not have a price tag on the lapel of my coat, he turns on me. Though Hardeman later apologized, Wallace was hurt so much so that he abandoned his leadership position in the anti-institutional movement. When Wallace's gospel guardian reemerged in 1949, Wallace was not involved, and Roy Codgill, Wallace's heir apparent, provided leadership for that adventure. And so we see how in these conflicts, those feelings and it's just, James talked about that. James talked about those passions within us that battle and everything. He said, hey, but often in the middle of these things, we can forget those things. We forget those more important things of how we're to be, and we let our what I call our natural self, where we need no training, come into play. And we see this happening among church leaders. And so what is there to learn from that? We need to think and take time, and it's challenging, it's difficult, it's complex. But this was not the end of the story, for Hardeman sought to force the issue by comparing congregational support of colleges to congregational support of orphans' homes. Okay? So Hardeman said, hey, wait a minute, we support orphan homes. So what's the difference? That opened a can of worms. Now some of you remember those controversies because they were in your time. That was obviously before my time. And so all of a sudden now that brought that in, and now part of the arguments of the equation is you can't support orphans' homes. And so are there any that experienced that here? Ken, did you? So it was real public, over the airwaves. And they were supportive or not supportive? So the larger congregation was the one supportive of the children's home. Was supportive of the children's home. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Severed. Sure. So a lot of pain over this. Sure. Sure. Yes. There's a spectrum, and as we often like to do, we like to really simplify it, and it may not be as simple. However, that probably was a significant aspect, because there were those that were saying if you support homes, you know, for the reason of the split was that isn't following the Bible. That isn't following God's word. You're not being a Christian because you're disavowing it.
Then
Well,
the other people says, how many kids do you have in your home? You know, that was the other argument.
we had, and I've kind of shared this before, but we had a congregation from St. Charles County tell us that, under the same argument, that because we support the food pantry and try and help feed people, the same exact thing. The same exact thing. And of course, he said those things were all resolved in the debates of the 1950s, which is the time we're talking about. So these things are coming about. Ken, were you saying more?
No, I was just agreeing with you, because I remember the event, and to me, it is absurd to assume that an issue is resolved in a debate.
It's not. It's not.
You know, I mean, the pain is still there, the job is still there, the need is still there, all the things still go on. And so it's tragic that.
The problem with the format of the debate was the purpose of the debate is to win, not to necessarily people have understanding. It's my argument is better than yours, and so I win. And that was, and you know what? That was the coin of the realm. And it wasn't unique, and we talked about all that in the 19th century when we looked at the Democratization of Christianity book, which was one of the books on your bibliography, which discusses that whole climate, and that was America. You know, that kind of thinking, and so, but and so when you then experience and live that, all of a sudden that kind of changes some of the perspective, especially if you're the one that's feeling the pain of it all, if you will. And so why is that? Because each side feels like they're following the Bible. We're trying to care about people is for the children's home. And the others say, wait, you can't do that, because where does it say you can do that? You know, and so.
I don't think it was about the caring of the children. It was more about you can't take money from this congregation, money from this congregation, and money from this congregation, and put it all together and do something.
Well, that's part of it, and that's the solution that was come up with.
The non-cooperation.
Well, those that wouldn't support, and others said, hey, well, wait a minute, we have a congregation of elders that are over it. You know, when we talk about missions here in a little bit, that was one of them was the Broadway congregation in Lubbock, Texas. And that was going to do a lot of the stuff to Germany after the war. And so that was how, that way it's not a missionary society, it's a local congregation in charge. Now, with Zambia, we send our support of there to the Sycamore in Memphis, I think it's in Memphis. And so that's exactly what that is, as to the way that's set up. And so anyhow, but the point is that this controversy raged in the 50s and was huge, and some here certainly have experienced it. Well, Hardeman in doing that caused things, as we said, to backfire in bringing in the orphans, and that just hurt the orphans' homes. You know, but it was not incorrect to say that it's really the same argument, because it was. You know, and so you can see these get complicated. In 1951, in a Harding College lecture dealing with support of orphans, G.C. Brewer flatly accused the anti-institutional movement of Phariseeism. The Pharisees who gave a tenth even of their garden herbs, but showed no mercy to the suffering, cared nothing for justice, had no real faith in God, said Brewer. Most among the mainstream churches of Christ now viewed the anti-institutional movement as cranky and hopelessly legalistic. And so what do? As people, we've seen somebody we feel strong about, and they don't, we categorize them, as Shane has preached before, label them. You know, we talked about, you know, one of my, during World War II, one of my favorite artists, Thomas Hart Benton, you know, Missouri artist. Well, he painted a whole bunch of anti-war, or not anti, but war stuff. And so the Japanese and the Germans are depicted as these beasts. And we looked at, it wasn't Thomas Hart, all Benton stuff, we looked at that character. And so your enemy becomes this beast and this horrible, brutal, you know, that's happening here. And James would say that's really worldly, what you're doing. You shouldn't be doing that. And yet, those things happen. The anti-institutional people, in turn, regarded the mainstream churches as irreverently devoted to modernizing schemes, institutional structures, and denominational standing. And so there we see the thrust of that, of what's going on, and that's still there today, though I don't think nearly to the degree it was then, but there's still those that hold to that. Now, missions. Missions began in earnest among our churches of Christ following World War II. Already during the war, various members stationed in the European theater submitted articles for the Gospel Advocate and the Firm Foundation urging a massive program of evangelism in that part of the world. And of course, why was that? Well, we've seen this terrible war, millions of people dying, and they mustn't have Christ, otherwise they wouldn't be doing that. And of course, yes, amen to those things. And so, but how could, and this is getting to what we're talking about, the cooperation in congregations, how could hundreds of congregations, all autonomous and independent, undertake such a massive task without some sort of cooperation? In other words, you know, 2 horses can do a whole lot more than one, so to speak, right? And we all understand that. Once again, the primary roots, people with primary roots in the Stone Lipscomb tradition took the lead in addressing this problem. Early in 1943, G.C. Brewer revealed, both in the Firm Foundation and the Advocate, that the Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas, where he served now as a preacher, would sponsor the plan for cooperative evangelism in post-war Europe. According to his plan, the Broadway congregation would receive funds from smaller congregations and then supervise the distribution of those funds in support of European missions. And so this concept, a way of doing things, has been going on in our fellowship for decades. It's well established. Those things aren't questioned by, people like it was then. Though there are congregations that don't support that. And so though arrangements of this sort were not altogether new, it was obvious that those who seized the initiative in post-war missions would have inevitably build a significant power base. In other words, that congregation became very influential, as we would understand. And for that reason, the plan drew immediate criticism from those. Hey, wait a minute. Why are you saying you're better than, you're more powerful? And so again, back to that autonomy question is causing some issues. For what authority does the Broadway congregation have to sponsor a plan for anybody else? Asked Cled Wallace. But criticism would not grow for several more years. In other words, even though these questions were being asked, like most things, they start out small and percolate and grow and then, eventually explode. And sometimes that takes decades, and that's in anything that goes on. In the meantime, M. Norval Young, who was one of the guys that started the 20th Century Christian magazine in Nashville, he became a preacher, then later Broadway, and later was the president of Pepperdine. And I think Charlie, did Charlie know him? Or knew of it, whatever. Yeah, that was Charlie's stomping ground back in the younger days, back in that area. And so M. Norval Young succeeded Brewer as a pulpit minister in 1944. Okay, war's not quite over. And for the next several years, 3 men from the congregation stirred enormous interest among churches of Christ and German missions. Those 3 included Young, Paul Sherrod, who was an elder, and Otis Gatewood, who became known as the best-known missionary to post-war Germany of our fellowship. I mentioned before this book that Jerry Jones gave me a long time ago, In the Footsteps of Hitler. That was Otis Gatewood that wrote that, and talking about, what he was doing over in Germany. Soon, the Union Avenue Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee, undertook a similar coordination for Japan. Okay, so Broadway's kind of covering Germany, Union's covering Japan, followed by the Crescent Hill Church in Brownfield, Texas. And where's Brownfield? We don't have Christiana here to tell us, right? It's South Texas.
That's Brownsville. Isn't Brownsville the one on the border?
Brownfield. This is Brownfield. It doesn't matter.
I never heard
And they undertook Italian missions. Okay, so they kind of coordinated it off, so that, just trying to figure it out. In the 20 years following the war, foreign mission activities among churches of Christ increased significantly. From 46 to 47, churches of Christ sponsored only 46 missionaries. By 1967, that number had grown to 724. So in 20 years, it just exploded. And we were probably all part of congregations that had some involvement with helping support those kind of efforts. Now, these figures reflect not only the growing interest in missions, but also a significantly enlarged domestic base of us here in the country. And as those of us that have looked at those things understood, we knew that was a time of tremendous growth in churches of Christ. I remember in college, and this was part of our campus ministry up there in Kirksville. I remember a brother telling me how the Church of Christ were the fastest growing congregation in the country, or fellowship in the country, and in other words, these kind of things. Apparently, now we'll talk about that in a second, it grew from 682,000 members. Now again, where they get all these, how they figure these out, some of that's come into question. Huh?
They didn't count our little congregation.
Well, we don't know. Well, because
My dad was.
we're gonna talk about that in a second. To by 1967, we had supposedly grown to 2,350,000 members. Now, some of us, and again, by some of us, I didn't come into this stuff until 1981. That's where I entered the picture. And so that's obviously after this. But in recent times, there's been a questioning of that figure and how it was determined. And this is by people in our fellowship that understand those things. And you realize that there's lots of assumptions made. And so maybe they never did talk to your congregation.
There wasn't enough of us to count anyway. But
Do what?
There wasn't enough of us to count. But I was told that in the 50s, it was the fastest growing.
And I don't think that's, in my readings, I don't think that's disputed. But the hard numbers are somewhat they're coming up with. And some of it's significantly lower than 2, but there was significant growth. And that went, and depending on who you're talking to or reading, apparently things kind of peaked around the early 80s. And again, with anything, you got to realize they try to find something to look on as to determining where they see a break, and often that's happening before that, and all that kind of stuff. And so apparently the 80s is when that growth stopped, meaning increasing, and kind of plateaued, and then now for several decades it's been dropping. And frankly, as you read stuff, it's much more rapid than that, and COVID just accelerated it. And again, not just us. It's a part of what's going on, which is why it's important that we understand the past so we can figure out now. Because, things aren't what they were, as far as that. So anyhow, were you going to say something, Joe? Oh. And so in the meantime, people within the anti-institutional movement grew more and more weary of the mission methods employed by mainstream churches of Christ. Their concern was not with missions per se, but with what they viewed as the mushrooming institutional machinery through which the mission work was accomplished. They objected as well to what they saw as a corresponding interest among many for standing, status, and prestige, both at home and abroad, for a denomination come of age. And so the complaints were, you're just wanting to be like everybody else. You're just wanting to get status. You're wanting to go from this country backwoods, no influence group to now look what you got on Union Avenue in Memphis, and so that gives you status with everybody else. Look at this edifice. It's kind of part of that. And so that's what's happening in this transition, and it wasn't easy.
And you had to look at their furs when you went there.
Well, and you're showing some of that, right? And I understand what you're saying.
I only went there once. Come on.
Well, I understand. Well, and of course, what was part of that was probably a significant economic divide from where you're coming from and from where they're at. And not necessarily, but we tended to cloak those biases in theological terms to justify what we felt like we did. We just tend to do that as people.
I just thought they were rich people.
Well, correct. But the thing is the rich part and not necessarily the theology part. But we often cloak it in that. But anyhow, so find that interesting. So this is a struggle going on. These feelings smoldered among anti-institutional people for several years following World War II and broke open in a major way in 1950. In that year, word came from Italy that Italian Catholics had attacked Church of Christ missionaries in a rock-throwing incident. So here it is over there. There's missionaries that we sent, and the Catholics are saying, get out of here. Because obviously Italy was a very, very Catholic country, obviously. And so And so that raised a big storm. And so churches at home responded with mass meetings in Houston and Dallas. Now, why they're particular, I can't answer that. And registered strong protests with both Congress and the State Department. Okay, now look what's happened here. From the group that started off as have nothing to do with them, we're in this world, it's going to get destroyed, to now run into the government for support and effort. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying, do you see something, this transition happening? And so embracing those things. Protests at the State Department seemed natural enough to the mainstream Churches of Christ by 1950. To the anti-institutional people, they reflected a high degree of acculturation and a loss of the old perspective. And Cled Wallace ridiculed the protests and mass meetings on the ground that they reflected nothing more or less than the denominational orientation of the world. In other words, in their view, they just kind of become part of the culture. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong or terrible or anything like that, but just you see this divide happening. And maybe if we keep our shirts and our hats on straight, our denomination may be able to appoint enough committees and draft enough resolutions to influence the Pope to call off his rock throwing. Obviously, he's being sarcastic. I'm not very optimistic over the prospect of persuading the President and the State Department to bomb the Vatican, but it is doubtful that our denomination is that popular in Washington at the present time. And so obviously he's being very sarcastic in what's going on. Wallace's article stirred up a hornet's nest within our mainstream Churches of Christ. Many interpreted Wallace's criticism as support for Italian Catholics against missionaries. So in other words, like we see in politics, how often do we see the other side take something somebody said, but when you really look at it, that's not really the context that was said in. And we all know what we're talking about. It's not all one-sided. That's what they do. And so in a sense, that's what's happening here. He's being sarcastic that they're involving themselves with the government. And of course, they're taking, well, he's saying it's okay for the Catholics to do it. Well, that isn't what was going on. But anyhow, many interpreted his support for the missionaries. Those who registered protest against his article along these lines revealed that they had virtually no comprehension of the point he was trying to make. Mr. and Mrs. Payton, who were parents of two of the Italian missionaries, complained that Wallace's reference to the Church of our Lord as our denomination. We are not a denomination, even in fun. And so that argument gets into it. And so all these things, everybody picking the one that's pricking them and making that part of it. And so, you know what, we will stop there. And so thank you for that. Hopefully we'll have some stuff, but appreciate all your comments and also insights and experiences of this. So thank you. And remember, next week is our combined class to hear our candidates.